Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, the place where the campfires never die and the legends of the American West are told in all their gritty, gun-smoke-laced glory. We spin the yarns of the heroes, the villains, and the folks in between who were forged in the crucible of the frontier. Before we ride into tonight's epic tale, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell, so you never miss a single story from the heart of the wild. Now, pour a coffee, pull your blanket tight, and listen to the story of the town they called Havens Fall, and the widow who taught the darkness to fear the dawn. The town of Havens Fall was a testament to a beautiful lie. Its name, chosen by its optimistic founders, promised a sanctuary, a gentle end to a long day's ride. The reality was a collection of tired wooden buildings clinging precariously to the edge of a vast, indifferent desert, a place where the sun didn't so much set as it bled out across the horizon, leaving behind a bruised and wounded sky. The haven was a cruel joke. The fall was a daily prophecy. The town's only real claim to being a haven was Dr. Thomas Vance. He was the town's heart and its conscience, a man whose hands were skilled in setting bones and stitching wounds, and whose voice was a constant, calm advocate for reason and community. He believed in Havens Fall, not for what it was, but for what it could be. His wife, Eleonora, or Nora as he called her, was the quiet soul of the town. She was a woman of books and gardens, of soft words and a gentle strength that complemented her husband's public fortitude. She was seen as the good doctor's delicate wife, a respected but ultimately fragile figure in this land of hard edges. The prophecy of the town's name was fulfilled by Jedediah Scar and his hounds. They weren't just outlaws, they were a plague on the territory, a pack of rabid dogs who saw places like Havens Fall not as communities of people, but as intended chicken coops, ripe for the slaughter. Scar, a man whose face was a roadmap of knife fights and bad intentions, considered the town his personal property. His periodic visits were less robberies and more acts of sheer, soul-crushing terror, designed to remind the townsfolk of their utter helplessness. The town's only law was a man named Sheriff Brody, a relic whose authority had long ago been dissolved in a bottle of whiskey and whose badge was little more than a tarnished piece of tin. He was a ghost at the feast, a symbol of the town's complete and utter vulnerability. On a blisteringly hot afternoon in late August, the hounds rode in. There were a dozen of them, a wave of dust and menace that washed over the single main street. They were not there for a quick raid. This was a demonstration. They terrorized the shopkeepers, drank the saloon dry, and fired their pistols into the air with gleeful abandon. Dr. Vance, as he always did, met the violence not with a gun, but with courage. When one of Scar's men began to brutally beat the blacksmith, Arthur Blackwood, for daring to look him in the eye, Thomas intervened. He stood between the brute and the fallen blacksmith, his medical bag in his hand, his body a frail but unyielding shield. "That's enough," Thomas said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in a river of chaos. Jedediah Scar, who had been watching from his saddle with a bored amusement, slowly dismounted. He walked towards the doctor, his spurs ringing a death knell on the dusty street. "Well, look here," Scar sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The sawbones has a spine. You think your books and your potions can stop a bullet, Doc?" "I think a man has to stand for something," Thomas replied, not flinching from Scar's foul, whiskey-laced breath. "This is our home." Scar laughed, a horrible, grating sound. "This is my dinner plate. And you, Doc, you're just the meat." He didn't draw fast. He didn't have to. It wasn't a duel. It was an execution. He pulled his heavy Colt revolver, aimed it deliberately, and shot Dr. Thomas Vance in the chest. Nora saw it all from the window of their small home next to the clinic. The world seemed to dissolve into a silent, slow-motion nightmare. She saw her husband, the center of her universe, clutch his chest, a look of shocked surprise on his face. She saw him fall to his knees, and then pitch forward into the dirt he had tried so hard to cultivate into a community. The hounds laughed. Jedediah Scar spat on the ground near Thomas's body, holstered his pistol, and led his men out of town, their brutal point having been made. The grief that descended upon Nora was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole the air from her lungs and the light from the world. The town, shamed and terrified, retreated into itself. They offered Nora their sympathies from a distance, their eyes unable to meet hers, as if her tragedy was a contagion they feared catching. For a week, she was a ghost, a specter of sorrow haunting the rooms she had shared with her husband. The town saw what it expected to see, a widow broken beyond repair, a woman who would soon pack her bags and flee back to the safety of the East. But beneath the crushing weight of her grief, something else was happening. The sorrow was not dissolving her, it was compressing her. All the love, the gentleness, the quiet patience she possessed was being squeezed by the relentless pressure of her loss, undergoing a terrible and powerful transformation. It was hardening, sharpening, crystallizing into a single, diamond-hard point of resolve. On the 8th day, she emerged from her home. She was still dressed in black. Her face was pale and drawn, but her eyes were different. The soft, gentle light was gone, replaced by the cold, clear gleam of polished steel. She walked directly to the center of town, to the very spot where her husband had died, and she rang the heavy iron bell outside the firehouse, a signal used only for dire emergencies. One by one, the townsfolk emerged from their homes and businesses, drawn by the insistent, demanding summons. They gathered before her, a nervous, shuffling crowd of about 30 men and a handful of women. They saw the doctor's widow, but they felt the presence of something new, something unsettling. When the last of them had gathered, Nora spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with a chilling clarity that made every person stand a little straighter. "My husband is dead," she began, her voice devoid of tears or tremor. "He died because he believed in this town. He died because he stood up, alone, while the rest of us hid. He died because we are a town of sheep, living in the shadow of wolves." She let her gaze sweep across their faces, meeting the eyes of the blacksmith, the reverend, the saloon owner, the young farmhands. "I will not hide any more," she declared. "Jedediah Scar and his men will be back. They think we are weak. They think we are broken. They are right. But that ends tonight. We have two choices. We can continue to be their victims, offering up our homes and our lives for their sport. Or we can become the instrument of our own salvation. We can become the wall they break themselves against. We can become the hunters." A nervous murmur went through the crowd. This was madness. They were farmers, shopkeepers, not gunfighters. "I am not asking you to be gunfighters," Nora's voice sliced through their doubts. "I am asking you to be smart, to be disciplined, to use this town, our home, as a weapon. I am asking you to stand with me, to train, to plan, and to fight. I will lead you. I will teach you. And together, we will make a promise, a vow, to my husband's memory and to our own future." She raised her head, her chin held high, her eyes burning with a cold fire that seemed to reflect the last, dying embers of the sunset. "We will make this town a fortress. And I swear on my husband's grave that the next time Scar's hounds, or any other outlaw filth, dares to bring violence to our home, they will not live to see the dawn." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a terrifying, audacious proposal from the most unlikely of sources. But in the eyes of the quiet widow, the cowed and broken people of Havens Falls saw not madness, but a terrible, beautiful, and desperately needed hope. They saw a leader. And in that moment, in the ashes of their shame and grief, the Havens Fall Militia was born. The town hall in Havens Fall was a drafty, barn-like structure that smelled of old wood and quiet desperation. That night, it was filled with the low murmur of 30 uncertain men, their faces illuminated by the flickering, anxious light of a dozen kerosene lamps. They had been summoned by Nora's bell, stirred by her words. But now, in the stark reality of the moment, doubt was a cold poison seeping back into their hearts. They were farmers whose hands knew the plow, not the pistol, a blacksmith whose hammer shaped steel for horseshoes, not for war, a reverend whose strength was in scripture, not in strategy. Nora stood before them, a solitary figure in black at the front of the room. Beside her was a large, crudely drawn map of the town that she had tacked to the wall. It depicted every street, every building, every alleyway. It was not a map of a home, it was a blueprint for a battlefield. "Look around you," she began, her voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the fear in the room. "Look at the man next to you. You see a farmer, a shopkeeper, a friend. Jedediah Scar sees cattle. He sees victims. The difference is not in what we are, but in how we choose to see ourselves." Arthur Blackwood, the blacksmith, a mountain of a man with a grim, soot-stained face, spoke first. His voice was a low rumble of skepticism. Words are fine, Mrs. Vance. But Scar has guns. And killers who know how to use them. What do we have? A few hunting rifles and a whole lot of fear. We have more than that, Arthur, Nora countered, turning to the map. Her finger traced the line of the main street. We have this. We have knowledge. Scar and his men, they see a street. I see a kill zone. They see a saloon. I see a fortified position. They see a hayloft. I see a sniper's nest. She moved with a newfound authority, a purpose that seemed to radiate from her, pushing back the shadows in the room. They have the advantage of skill, yes. But we have the advantage of preparation, of surprise. They will come expecting sheep, and they will find a perfectly laid trap. We will not meet them in the open street, in a fair fight. A fair fight is what got my husband killed. We will be unfair. We will be intelligent. We will be ruthless. She then laid out the first stages of her strategy, and the sheer, cold logic of it began to chip away at their fear. Her plan was not about courage, it was about geometry and timing. The main street has only 2 entry points, she explained, pointing to either end of the map. We will make them believe these are open, but they will be funnels. Arthur, your blacksmith shop is here, at the north end. It has a stone foundation and thick walls. It will be our northern anchor. The church, she looked at the Reverend Michael, a pale, scholarly man who looked deeply uncomfortable, is at the south end. It is also made of stone, our southern anchor. The battle will be fought in the space between them. She described how they would use ropes and heavy wagons, hidden in the alleys, to block the street behind the outlaws once they had entered, trapping them. She talked about using the rooftops, about creating firing positions that would allow them to shoot down on their enemies, protected from returning fire. She spoke of tripwires and simple traps, of using darkness and confusion as their allies. But we don't know how to fight, a young farmhand named Billy, whose father had been one of Scar's past victims, said, his voice cracking. We'll just end up shooting each other in the dark. That is where discipline comes in, Nora said, her gaze softening for a moment as she looked at the boy. And that is what I will teach you. From tomorrow, we train. Every morning, before the sun is fully up. We will learn to handle a rifle not as a tool for hunting deer, but as an instrument of defense. We will learn to move not as a mob, but as a unit. We will learn to listen, to wait, and to act on my command and my command alone. The Reverend Michael finally spoke, his voice filled with a troubled anguish. Mrs. Vance, Eleonora, what you are asking of us, it is the path of violence. The Bible teaches us to turn the other cheek. Nora turned to face him, her expression hardening again. Reverend, my husband was a good man who lived by the book. His cheek was turned, and for his faith, Jedediah Scar put a bullet through his heart. I have no other cheek to turn. We are not talking about vengeance, though God knows I feel its pull. We are talking about survival. We are talking about protecting the flock you have sworn to shepherd. The Lord may provide, but He expects us to lock the door against wolves. We are going to build the lock. Her words, stark and pragmatic, silenced the room. She was stripping away their excuses, their reliance on a faith that had not protected them, and replacing it with a demand for self-reliance. She looked from face to face, her eyes locking with each man's. I need your oath, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more power than a shout. Not to me, but to this town, and to the memory of the good people we have lost. Swear with me now, that from this day forward, any man who brings murder and ruin to our streets will find this town his final resting place. Swear that they will never see another dawn. A long, tense silence followed. It was Arthur Blackwood who broke it. He stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow. He looked at Nora, then at the map, and then at the faces of his neighbors. The doctor. He fixed my daughter's arm when she fell from the loft. He said, his voice thick with emotion. He charged me nothing. I owe him. I owe this town. He turned to Nora and gave a single, firm nod. I swear it. My forge and my hammer are yours. That was the first crack in the dam of fear. Young Billy, his eyes blazing with a mix of grief and youthful fire, stepped forward next. For my pa, he whispered. I swear it. One by one, they came forward. The saloon owner, Mario, a tough, pragmatic woman who had seen more than her share of Scar's depravity. the quiet store owner, the nervous ranchers. Even the Reverend Michael, his face a mask of turmoil, gave a slow, pained nod. He would not hold a gun, he said, but he would tend to the wounded, and he would pray for their souls, friend and foe alike. He would be their moral anchor in the storm to come. When the last man had given his word, a new feeling settled over the room. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of their stomachs. But it was no longer alone. It now shared space with a fragile, but fierce, new emotion purpose. They were no longer a scattered collection of victims. They were unit, bound by an oath. Nora looked at the faces of her new militia, her flawed, terrified, and utterly determined army. She knew the path ahead would be soaked in blood and sorrow. She knew that she was leading these good, simple men towards a darkness that might consume them all. But as she looked at them, she saw the faintest glimmer of a new beginning, a chance that Heaven's Fall might one day, finally, live up to its name. The oath had been sworn. The strategy was laid. The dawn was a long way off, and the night would have to be won first. The transformation of Heaven's Fall began not with the clang of gunfire, but with the rhythmic thump of hammers and the scrape of shovels in the pre-dawn chill. Nora Vance was a relentless architect, and her raw materials were the town's buildings, its terrain, and the soft clay of its citizenry, which she intended to fire into hard ceramic. Her days were a blur of calculated activity. In the evenings, she devoured the only military book her husband had owned, a worn copy of a treatise on Napoleonic tactics, of all things. While the grand strategies of European armies seemed a world away, she found universal truths in its pages: the importance of high ground, the value of disciplined volley fire, the strategic use of terrain to funnel and trap an enemy. She adapted these principles to the scale of a single, dusty street, her mind a whirlwind of angles, sightlines, and contingency plans. Her field headquarters was Arthur Blackwood's smithy. The blacksmith, having pledged his loyalty, became her chief engineer. Under her direction, the forge, once a place for creating tools of life and labor, began to produce instruments of war. They were not subtle. They were brutal, practical, and designed to work. "I want caltrops," she told him, showing him a sketch she'd made. Dozens of them. Simple, four-pointed iron spikes. Easy to make, easy to scatter. They won't stop a man, but they will cripple a horse, turn a charge into a chaotic pileup. Blackwood nodded, his mind already calculating the time and the amount of iron needed. Simple enough. Next, she continued, pointing to a larger, more complex diagram. "I want you to build me 3 of these." It was a design for a heavy log fall trap. A massive log or a bundle of heavy timbers, held precariously on the flat roofs of the town's strongest buildings, attached to a pulley system. A single, stout rope, when cut, would send the payload crashing down into the street below. The impact will be devastating. The sound alone will create panic. Blackwood looked at the design, a grim respect dawning in his eyes. This was not the work of a sentimental woman. This was the cold, hard engineering of death. "It'll take time," he said, "but I can do it." While Blackwood and his apprentices worked in the fiery glow of the forge, Nora worked on her human material. The training sessions were held in a secluded canyon just outside of town. They were grueling and unforgiving. She was not a natural drill sergeant, but she possessed something more effective, an unshakable, ice-cold certainty that commanded respect. She started with the basics. She made them run, building their stamina. She made them crawl, teaching them to use cover. Most importantly, she taught them to handle their weapons. Many of the men were familiar with hunting rifles, but she had to break them of their solitary hunter habits. "You are not hunters anymore," she told them, her voice sharp and clear, echoing off the canyon walls. "You are a single weapon. You do not fire when you have a clean shot. You do not fire when you feel the urge. You fire when I give the order. All of you, at once. A wall of lead. That is how we will stop a charge. That is how we will break their spirit." She divided them into squads. The older, steadier hands were designated as riflemen, positioned on the rooftops she had selected. The younger, quicker men, like Billy, were formed into mobile units, armed with shotguns, tasked with defending the barricades and moving through the alleyways. She drilled them relentlessly on a single, core concept: the prepared ambush. She would designate a kill zone in the canyon and make them practice entering it, seeing it from the enemy's perspective. Then she would have them take up their assigned positions and wait, sometimes for an hour in total silence, teaching them the hardest discipline of all, patience. The moment they enter our town, they are already dead, she would tell them. They just don't know it yet. Our job is to wait until they are in the deepest part of the grave we have dug for them, and only then do we start shoveling the dirt. She taught them to use the town itself. She had them practice scaling the walls of the saloon to get to the roof quickly. She mapped out the alleyways, creating a network of hidden pathways that only they would know, allowing them to move from one end of the town to the other, unseen. She designated certain buildings as fallback positions, fortifying their doors and windows. Maria, the saloon owner, proved to be one of her most valuable assets. Her establishment, the Dusty Spur, was the town's social hub. She became Nora's intelligence officer. She listened to the whispers of passing travelers, gathering information on Scar's movements, his numbers, the mood of his men. Her reports were invaluable, allowing Nora to refine her plans. Even the Reverend Michael found his role. He did not train with the militia, but he became its heart. He moved among the men, offering quiet words of encouragement. He organized the women of the town to prepare food and medical supplies. He was creating the support structure, the logistical and spiritual backbone that would hold them together when the fighting started. He was still a man of peace, but he had accepted that to preserve the peace, his flock must first prepare for war. The transformation was gradual, but profound. The slumped shoulders of the townsmen began to straighten. The fearful, downcast eyes were replaced by a watchful, steady gaze. They moved with a new purpose. They were still farmers and shopkeepers, but they were no longer sheep. They were a pack. They were a shield, being forged in the heat of their shared purpose and hammered into shape by the widow's iron will. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of training, young Billy approached Nora. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt, but his eyes were shining. "We can do this, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice filled with a conviction that hadn't been there a month ago. "We can really do this." Nora looked at the boy, at the fierce hope in his eyes, and felt a pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, a deep, aching sorrow for the innocence she was being forced to take from him. She was turning a boy into a soldier. She was turning a peaceful town into a fortress. She was saving them, but she was also changing them, and she knew that some part of the haven she and Thomas had loved would be lost forever in the process. "Yes, Billy," she said, her voice softer than usual. "We can. Now go clean your rifle. The work is not done yet." The shield was almost forged. It was imperfect, it was manned by amateurs, but it was strong, and it was ready. All that was left was for the enemy to test it. The whispers of the changes in Haven's fall eventually reached the ears of Jedediah Scar. At first, he dismissed them as the ramblings of frightened travelers. The idea of the doctor's mousy widow leading an army of farmers was laughable. But the rumors persisted. Travelers spoke of a town that was different, quieter, more watchful. A town where the men walked with a purpose, and the saloon was no longer a place for easy information. Scar's amusement curdled into annoyance. He saw it as an act of defiance, a foolish gesture by a town that needed to be reminded of its place. He decided to send a message, a small, sharp reminder of who held the real power. He dispatched 3 of his men, a trio of particularly cruel thugs led by a man named Cletus, with simple instructions: ride into Haven's Fall, collect a tax from the general store, break a few things to show who was boss, and be back by nightfall. It was a routine act of intimidation, something they had done a dozen times before. Nora, through Maria's network, knew they were coming days before they arrived. The news sent a ripple of controlled panic through her fledgling militia. This was it. The first test. All the training, all the preparation, was about to be put on the line. "This is not the main battle," Nora told her assembled militia in the town hall, her voice cutting through their anxiety. "This is a probe, a test. They are sending 3 men to see if we will flinch. We will not. We will not kill them. We will swallow them whole. We will capture them, humiliate them, and send them back as a message of our own. Today, we show the wolves that the sheep have grown teeth." Her plan was one of overwhelming force and psychological shock. It was designed to be executed with a swift, silent precision that would leave the outlaws no time to react. The stage was set on the main street. It was a hot, sleepy afternoon. The town appeared normal, perhaps even more deserted and frightened than usual. This was part of the deception. The streets were empty, but the rooftops and alleyways were not. 10 of her best riflemen, concealed behind newly built parapets of wood and sandbags, watched the southern entrance to town. Another 10 men, armed with shotguns, were hidden in the alleys and inside the saloon, waiting. Arthur Blackwood was in his smithy, the large front door slightly ajar. Beside him was the release mechanism for his newest, simplest trap, a massive cargo net, weighted with iron scraps, hoisted into the rafters of the wide awning that stretched over the street in front of his shop. Nora's command post was the bell tower of the church, which gave her a commanding view of the entire street. She had a pair of her husband's field glasses and a simple signaling system. One ring of the church bell meant stand by, two meant spring the trap, and a continuous, frantic ringing meant open fire. At just past 2 o'clock, 3 riders appeared as specks of dust on the southern horizon. Nora watched them through her glasses, her heart a cold, steady drum in her chest. Cletus and his men rode in with a swaggering arrogance, their laughter echoing in the natural quiet. They saw the empty street as a sign of fear, confirmation of their power. They rode past the church, past the saloon, heading for the general store in the center of town. They were deep inside the kill zone. Nora watched them, her hand on the bell rope. She let them dismount. She let them tie up their horses. She let Cletus kick open the door to the general store. She waited, letting the silence stretch, tightening the knot of tension. Then, from the tower, she pulled the rope once. Bang! The single, resonant chime echoed through the town. It was the signal. Stand by. On the rooftops, rifles were silently cocked. In the alleys, shotguns were gripped tighter. Cletus emerged from the store, dragging the terrified owner by the collar. Town's got an awful quiet, he bellowed for all to hear. Time to make some noise. He threw the store owner to the ground and raised his pistol to fire into the air. Nora pulled the rope twice. Bang! Bang! The response was instantaneous and perfectly coordinated. From the alleys on both sides of the street, Nora's men rolled out to heavy farm wagons, sealing both ends of the central town square. At the same moment, Arthur Blackwood threw his weight against the release lever in his smithy. With a loud swoosh of rope and a groan of wood, the massive, weighted net dropped from the awning, enveloping the 3 outlaws and their horses in its heavy mesh. The surprise was absolute. Cletus and his men were tangled and thrown to the ground before they could even comprehend what was happening. Their horses, panicked and trapped, thrashed wildly, adding to the chaos. Before the outlaws could entangle themselves or reach for their guns, the second phase of the trap was sprung. The doors of the saloon, the general store, and the hotel burst open, and 20 men with shotguns emerged, forming a perfect, inescapable circle around the netted outlaws. From the rooftops above, 20 rifles were now aimed down at them, the sun glinting off their long barrels. In the space of 10 seconds, Cletus and his men had gone from masters of the town to helpless rats in a cage, surrounded on all sides, with death looking down on them from every angle. Their arrogance evaporated, replaced by a stark, primal fear. Nora descended from the bell tower and walked calmly into the street. The militia parted for her, their faces grim and determined. She stopped before the struggling, netted men, her shadow falling over them. Cletus stared up at her, his face a mixture of hatred and utter disbelief. "The widow," he snarled, spitting dust from his mouth. "Welcome to Heaven's Fall, Mr. Cletus," Nora said, her voice as cold and hard as a winter morning. "It seems you've had some trouble. Allow us to help you." They were disarmed, dragged from the net, and tied securely. The entire operation had been executed without a single shot being fired. It was a silent, overwhelming display of discipline and preparation. Nora had Cletus and his men tied to their own horses, facing backward. She hung signs around their necks, hand-painted in stark black letters. They read, "Property of Heaven's Fall. Return to sender. Go back to your master," Nora told the terrified Cletus. "Tell him what you saw here. Tell him this was a warning. Tell him the next time he sends his hounds to our home, they will not be returning at all. They will be buried here. Now go." She had one of her men slap the rumps of the horses, sending them galloping out of town, carrying their humiliated riders back to Scar. As the dust settled, a cheer went up from the militia. It was a raw, cathartic sound. They had faced the enemy, and they had won. They had not just followed orders, they had acted as a single, cohesive unit. They had seen the proof that Nora's mad plan could actually work. Nora did not join in the cheering. She watched the dust cloud of the retreating outlaws disappear on the horizon. The first probe had been repelled, but she knew this was only the beginning. She had not just returned 3 humiliated men. She had sent a declaration of war. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Jedediah Scar would answer. The return of Cletus and his men was not the triumphant arrival Jedediah Scar had expected. They limped back into his sprawling, filthy camp not as conquerors, but as a trio of beaten dogs, their heads bowed in humiliation, the mocking signs still hanging from their necks. The story they told of a silent, perfectly executed trap, of being surrounded in seconds by a ghost army of farmers was met first with disbelief, then with derisive laughter from the other hounds. But Scar was not laughing. He listened to Cletus's stammering account, his cold, dead eyes fixed on the man's terrified face. He was a predator, and he recognized the scent of a genuine threat. This was not a lucky stand. This was organized. This was intelligent. He had dismissed the widow as a harmless nuisance, and in doing so, he had committed the one sin he never forgave in others. He had underestimated his enemy. His rage was not the hot, explosive anger of his underlings. It was a cold, coiling thing, a serpent uncurling in the pit of his gut. The widow had not just defied him, she had mocked him. She had turned his own men into a message of her strength. This was an insult that could not be answered with another casual raid. It had to be answered with annihilation. So, the little mouse has built a mousetrap, Scar rasped to his assembled men, his voice silencing their laughter. She thinks her farmers and their pitchforks can stand against us. She thinks she can turn my own backyard into a fortress. He paced before them, his movements slow and deliberate. She is wrong. We are not 3 drunken fools on a Sunday ride. We are the hounds. And when a dog gets bitten by a rat, it does not run. It returns and tears the nest apart, killing every last squeaking thing inside. His eyes gleamed with a malevolent fire. We are going to visit Heaven's Fall. All of us. We will not ride in at noon. We will ride in at the blackest hour of the night. We will come not to tax them, but to burn them. We will tear down their pathetic barricades, drag their soldiers into the street, and make an example of them that will be told in this territory for 100 years. And the widow, I will save for last. I will make her watch as I salt the earth of her husband's grave with the ashes of her precious town. It was not a plan, it was a promise of apocalyptic retribution. Scar's reply would not be a probe, it would be a flood, intended to wash Heaven's Fall from the face of the earth. Back in the town, the victory over Cletus's party had given the militia a surge of confidence, but Nora felt no such elation. She knew that her carefully crafted message would be received not as a deterrent, but as a challenge. She had poked the serpent, and now it would strike with its full venom. Her inner world was a quiet, lonely place. The leader she presented to the town decisive, cold, strategic was a necessary mask. Behind it, the grieving widow still existed, recoiling in horror at the woman she was becoming. She spent her nights poring over the town map, her husband's books on tactics spread around her, seeking not just a path to victory, but a path that would cost the fewest lives among the people she had sworn to protect. She wrestled with the morality of her actions. Was this justice for Thomas, or was it a dark, all-consuming vengeance that was twisting her into the same kind of monster she was fighting? Each trap she designed, each order she gave, felt like a step away from the woman her husband had loved. She was sacrificing her own humanity to save the town's, and the weight of that sacrifice was a constant, crushing presence. She found herself talking to Thomas in the silence of their empty home, sometimes asking for his forgiveness, other times for his strength. She was both the general and the most tormented soldier in her own army. Maria's network of informants soon brought the news Nora had been dreading and expecting. Scar was gathering his entire force, nearly 30 men, all of them seasoned killers. They were stocking up on ammunition and whiskey. They were not planning a raid, they were planning a massacre. And they would come at night. Nora called a meeting of her militia. The mood was starkly different from their celebratory cheers just days before. The reality of what was coming settled over them like a funeral shroud. "He is coming," she told them, her voice steady and grim. "All of them. He will come at night, expecting to find us asleep and afraid. He believes he will find sheep cowering in the dark. Instead, he will find the anvil, and we will be the hammer." Her strategy for the final battle was an evolution of her earlier plan. It was built on the principle of a layered, defense-in-depth strategy, designed to bleed the enemy, disorient them, and channel them into a final, inescapable killing ground. "He thinks the darkness is his ally," she explained, her pointer tapping the town map. "We will make it his worst enemy. We will not light the streets. We will keep the town in absolute darkness. We will be the ghosts. They will be the ones who are blind." The plan had 3 stages. Stage 1, the approach. Nora had her men dig a series of deep, narrow trenches, like tank traps for horses, on the 2 main roads a quarter-mile outside of town. The trenches were covered with flimsy brush and a layer of dust, making them invisible in the dark. These were designed to break the momentum of Scar's charge, throwing his riders into chaos and confusion before they even reached the town. Stage 2, the funnel. As the disorganized riders approached the town's entrance, they would find it seemingly open. But this was a deception. Inside the town, Nora's forces would be hidden, silent. The moment the bulk of Scar's gang was inside the main street, Arthur Blackwood's logfall traps would be triggered, not just to kill, but to create massive, impassable barricades at both ends of the street, sealing them inside. Stage 3, the cauldron. Trapped between the log falls, the outlaws would find themselves in a perfectly prepared kill zone. The rooftops would be lined with her riflemen. The alleyways would be filled with her shotgun squads. And this time, there would be a new element, fire. She had Maria and the other women prepare dozens of bottles filled with kerosene and fitted with cloth wick-screwed but effective firebombs. "They want to burn our town," Nora said, her eyes glittering in the lamplight. "We will use their own weapon against them. We will use the light of the fires to see them, while we remain hidden in the darkness. We will turn our main street into a cauldron of fire, lead, and terror." The militia listened, their faces pale but resolute. The fear was there, a palpable thing. But beneath it was the hard-earned steel of their training and the binding power of their oath. They were no longer just defending their homes. They were defending the idea of heaven's fall, the sanctuary they were now willing to die for. Nora looked at their faces, at Arthur's grim determination, at young Billy's nervous bravery, at the Reverend's pained acceptance. She was their leader. Their hopes, their lives, were in her hands. The serpent was coming, and the fall of Haven was at hand. But she would ensure, with every fiber of her being, that the fall would be Scar's, not theirs. The night descended on Haven's fall like a black shroud, thick and starless. A nervous, oppressive silence settled over the town, a silence that was not empty but pregnant with anticipation. Every house was dark, every window shuttered. To an outsider, the town would have looked deserted, abandoned to the coyotes and the wind. But it was not empty. It was coiled, a predator holding its breath, waiting. Every member of the militia was in their pre-assigned position. Nora had walked the lines herself as dusk fell, her presence a calming, steadying force. She spoke a quiet word to each squad leader, her voice betraying none of the turmoil that churned within her. She saw the fear in their eyes, and she met it with a confidence so absolute that it became a shield for them all. Arthur Blackwood and his strongest apprentices were on the roofs of the saloon and the hotel, their hands on the ropes of the log-fall traps. Young Billy and his shotgun squad were crouched in the dark, cavernous mouth of the livery stable, the scent of hay and nervous sweat thick in the air. The riflemen were shadows among the chimneys and water barrels on the rooftops, their long guns resting on sandbags, their sights aimed at the blackness where the street should be. Nora's command post was again the church bell tower. It was the town's highest point, offering a god's-eye view. With her were the Reverend Michael and 2 young boys who would act as runners, carrying her orders to the squads below. The Reverend did not hold a weapon. He held a lantern, its light carefully shielded, and a bag full of bandages. He was there to be the town's soul, even as its body went to war. The waiting was the hardest part. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every gust of wind sounded like the thunder of hooves, every rustle of leaves like the cocking of a pistol. The men's nerves were stretched taut, like bowstrings. Just after 2 in the morning, they came. Nora saw them first through her field glasses, a dark, flowing mass against the slightly less dark horizon. It was not a disciplined column, it was a horde, thundering across the desert floor. Their approach meant to be an act of terror in itself. "They're coming," she said, her voice a low, calm whisper. The runner beside her nodded and slipped out of the tower to pass the final alert. "Hold! Wait for the signal." Scar and his hounds, drunk on whiskey and the promise of slaughter, charged towards the town at a full gallop. They never saw the hidden trenches. The front rank of riders vanished as if the earth had swallowed them. The night was torn apart by the sudden, horrific screams of men and the high-pitched, agonized shrieks of horses. Riders in the second rank, unable to stop, plowed into the chaos, their own mounts stumbling and falling, creating a tangled, writhing pile-up of broken bodies and flailing limbs. Scar's terrifying charge had been shattered before it had even begun. From the bell tower, Nora watched the chaos through her glasses. Her face was a stone mask. Phase 1 complete. Jedediah Scar, who had been riding in the center of the pack, managed to control his rearing horse. He was screaming curses into the darkness, trying to bring order to the pandemonium. "Get through? Get through to the town," he roared. Perhaps a dozen of his men, those who had avoided the trenches, regrouped and spurred their horses forward, their lust for battle now mixed with a frantic rage. They galloped the final quarter-mile and plunged into the dark, silent maw of Havens Falls Main Street. They rode past the blacksmith shop, past the saloon. The street was empty, silent, and dark. Too dark. An unnatural silence. A shiver of unease, for the first time, cut through Scar's rage. This felt wrong. He and his men were in the center of the town. The trap was full. From the bell tower, Nora gave the signal she had been waiting to give. She did not ring the bell. She fired a single shot from her revolver into the night sky. The shot was the trigger. From the rooftops, 2 ropes were severed simultaneously. With a sound like thunder, the massive log-fall traps at both ends of the street were released. They crashed down with bone-jarring force, blocking the street with an impenetrable wall of splintered timber. Jedediah Scar and his men were sealed in. The sound of the falling logs was immediately followed by a new, terrifying sound, the shattering of glass. From the rooftops and the upper windows of the buildings, Nora's firebombs began to rain down. They weren't aimed at the men, but at the street around them and at the wooden fronts of the buildings. The dark street erupted in blossoms of fire. Flames shot up from the dust, licking at the walls of the saloon and the general store. The night was suddenly alive with a wild, flickering, demonic light. The outlaws, their eyes adjusted to the blackness, were now blinded by the glare, their horses screaming and rearing in terror. They were perfect silhouettes, trapped in a river of fire. Now, Nora's voice screamed from the darkness, an avenging angel's cry. From the rooftops, the riflemen opened fire. It was not a panicked fusillade. It was the disciplined, rolling volley she had drilled into them. A wall of lead tore through the outlaws' ranks. Men were ripped from their saddles, their bodies illuminated for a brief, ghastly moment by the flames before they fell. From the alleyways, Billy and the shotgun squads unleashed their own devastating volleys, their weapons sifting through the trapped riders at close range. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The hounds, so accustomed to being the purveyors of terror, were now its victims. They were trapped, blinded, and being systematically cut to pieces from all sides by an enemy they could not see. Their return fire was wild and panicked, their bullets thudding harmlessly into the stone and thickwood of the buildings. Jedediah Scar, a charmed devil, was still alive. His horse had been shot out from under him, and he had taken cover behind the animal's corpse. His face, illuminated by the fires, was a mask of utter disbelief and incandescent rage. He had walked into a meat grinder. "Reform! To the saloon!" he bellowed, trying to rally the few men still standing. He and 4 of his remaining hounds made a desperate dash for the saloon's swinging doors, seeing it as their only hope of solid cover. Nora had anticipated this. "Billy," she had instructed, "if they try for the saloon, you let them in. Then you seal the exit." As Scar and his men burst through the doors, Billy and his squad, who had been hiding across the street, sprinted from their cover. They did not try to follow the outlaws in. Instead, they threw a heavy bar across the outside of the doors and used ropes to lash them shut. Scar and his men were now trapped inside the burning building. The final act of the longest night had begun. The dusty Spur Saloon, once a place of raucous life, had become a tomb. Trapped inside, Jedediah Scar and his last 4 hounds found themselves in a hell of their own making. The firebombs had ignited the front of the building, and thick, choking smoke was pouring through the shattered windows. The air was scorching, filled with the roar of the growing blaze and the panicked whinnies of trapped horses outside. The back door, Scar croaked, his eyes streaming. They stumbled through the smoke-filled room, knocking over tables and chairs, and threw themselves at the rear exit. It was barred from the outside. They were sealed in. Panic, Ryan absolute, finally broke through Scar's iron composure. They were going to burn alive. From her vantage point in the bell tower, Nora watched the saloon burn. The screams from within were horrific, a sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. She could end it. A word to her riflemen, and a volley through the windows would grant them a quicker death. She looked at the Reverend Michael, his face a pale, agonized mask in the flickering firelight, his hands clasped in prayer. She saw the torment in his eyes, a reflection of her own. This was the precipice, the final, terrible choice between justice and vengeance. Her husband had been executed without mercy. These men had laughed. Her heart, the part of her that was still the grieving widow, screamed for them to suffer, to burn, to pay for their sins in the most agonizing way possible. But the leader, the woman who had asked these townsfolk to become soldiers, not murderers, knew that this was a line she could not let them cross. They were fighting for the soul of their town. They could not lose their own in the process. Arthur, her voice, amplified by a speaking trumpet she had prepared, cut through the din of the battle. Break open the back door. Let them out. On the ground, Arthur Blackwood, who had been coordinating the barricade squads, looked up in confusion. But he did not question the order. He trusted her. He and 2 of his men ran to the rear of the saloon, their axes ready. Inside, Scar and his men heard the splintering of wood. Hope, wild and desperate, surged through them. They thought it was their allies, somehow come to their rescue. They huddled by the back door, ready to burst out. With a final crash, the door gave way. Scar and his men stumbled out into the back alley, gasping for air, their faces black with soot. They were not met by friends. They were met by Arthur Blackwood, who stood before them like a vengeful giant, his massive smithing hammer held in his hands. Behind him were a dozen men with leveled shotguns. The alley was a dead end. There was no fight left in Scar's men. They dropped their guns and raised their hands, their faces slack with terror and exhaustion. But Jedediah Scar was not a man who surrendered. With a guttural roar of pure, nihilistic rage, he drew a hunting knife from his boot and charged directly at Arthur. The blacksmith did not flinch. He was not a trained fighter, but he was a man defending his home, his family, his leader's command. He met Scar's charge not with fear, but with the righteous fury of a good man pushed too far. He swung the heavy hammer in a deadly arc. The sound of its impact was sickeningly final. Jedediah Scar, the terror of the territory, the murderer of Dr. Thomas Vance, fell to the ground, his reign of terror ended by the very tool of honest labor he had so long despised. As Scar fell, a profound silence descended over the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of the dying fires. It was over. The sun began to rise, its first pale, gray light illuminating a scene from a nightmare. The main street was a wasteland of corpses, both man and horse, of shattered wood and smoldering ashes. The air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke and death. The townsfolk, the militia, slowly emerged from their positions. They were grimy, exhausted, and shell-shocked. But they were alive. They had done it. They had faced the monster in the dark, and they had won. Nora descended from the bell tower, her body aching, her soul numb. She walked through the street, her street, now a graveyard of her own making. Her people gathered around her, their faces filled with a mixture of horror and a profound, bone-deep respect. Young Billy, his face streaked with soot and tears, looked at her as if she were a queen. Arthur Blackwood gave her a single, solemn nod of victory. Nora walked to the center of the street and looked at the carnage. The cost of their survival was laid bare in the morning light. She had saved them. She had fulfilled her oath. Her husband was avenged. But the victory felt like ashes in her mouth. She had led them through the fire, but she knew the burns would scar them all forever. She looked up at the rising sun, its light washing over the ruined town, and she felt a wave of crushing exhaustion. The battle was over, but her war, the war for her own soul, felt as if it had only just begun. She stood alone amidst the ruin and the dawn, a legend forged in fire, a widow who had saved her people, but who feared she had lost herself. The dawn that broke over Haven's fall was not one of triumph, but of grim, exhausted reckoning. The rising sun illuminated the brutal cost of their survival. The main street was a charnel house, a testament to the night's terrible violence. The living moved like ghosts through the ruins of their own town, their faces smudged with soot and shock. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and the metallic tang of blood. The militia, no longer soldiers but farmers and shopkeepers once more, began the grim task of cleaning up. They dragged the bodies of the outlaws to a mass grave at the edge of town, their movements slow and heavy. There was no celebration, no cheering. The adrenaline of the fight had worn off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the nauseating reality of what they had done. They had killed. They had taken lives to protect their own, and the knowledge of that settled on them like a shroud. Nora Vance was the center of this quiet storm of aftermath. She moved among her people, her voice low and steady, giving orders for the cleanup, directing the care of the few wounded militia members, her mind still a fortress of command and control. But beneath the surface, she was crumbling. Every dead outlaw was a testament to her strategy, but also a weight on her soul. She saw her husband's face in the flickering embers of the saloon. She heard his gentle voice in the pained groans of the wounded. She had won his vengeance, but she had done so by embracing the very violence he had abhorred. The townsfolk looked at her with a new emotion. The pity was long gone. The respect was still there, but it was now mingled with something else all, and a hint of fear. She was no longer just the doctor's widow. She was the woman who had called down fire and death upon their enemies. She had saved them, but she had also become something other, something they couldn't entirely comprehend. She was their savior, but she was no longer one of them. She was a legend, and legends are, by their nature, lonely things. Arthur Blackwood approached her as she stood looking at the blackened shell of the saloon. He held the hammer he had used to kill Scar, his knuckles white round the handle. "It's done, Nora," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "They're all taken care of." He looked down at the hammer. I never thought I would." "You did what you had to do to protect this town, Arthur," Nora said, her voice softer than it had been in months. "We all did. That is the burden we will have to carry." "And you?" he asked, looking at her, really looking at her, for the first time since the battle. He saw the profound exhaustion in her eyes, the deep, sorrowful lines etched on her mouth. "What burden do you carry?" "All of it," she whispered, the mask of the general finally cracking for a moment. "I carry all of it." The days that followed were a blur of rebuilding. The town, united by the shared trauma and the hard-won victory, worked together with a new sense of purpose. They cleared the rubble. They repaired the damaged buildings. They buried their dead. The militia did not disband. It became a permanent fixture of the town, a symbol of their new reality. They continued to drill, to stand watch, their discipline a testament to the leader who had forged them. But the scars were not just on the buildings. They were on the people. The men who had fought were quieter, their eyes older. Young Billy had lost the fire of youthful bravado, replaced by a man's somber understanding of violence. The Reverend Michael held a special service, not of celebration, but of mourning for the lives lost on both sides, and for the innocence their town had shed. Nora found she could no longer live in the house she had shared with Thomas. It was a museum of a life that no longer existed, of a woman she no longer was. She moved into a small room above the general store, a simple, Barton space. She tried to return to her books, but the words seemed hollow. She tried to tend a small garden in a window box, but her hands, which had signed orders for death, felt alien amongst the gentle green shoots. She was adrift. The purpose that had driven her, that had consumed her for months, was gone, leaving a vast, aching void. She had won the war, but she had not found peace. One evening, a month after the battle, the new sheriff, a young, determined man appointed by the territory and welcomed by the town, came to see her. He was there to officially close the book on the Scar Gang incident. "The territory owes you a debt, Mrs. Vance," he said, his respect for her palpable. "What you did here, It's already becoming a story they tell from here to Tucson. It wasn't a story, Sheriff, Nora said, her gaze distant. It was a long night, and the morning was very cold. The town wants you to stay on as head of the militia council, he offered. They trust you. They'll follow you anywhere. Nora looked out the window at the town below. The street was rebuilt. There were children playing where the fires had burned. Life was returning. It was a haven again, a real one this time, because it had been tested, and it had held. She had given them that, but her part in it was over. No, Sheriff, she said, turning back to him. My work here is done. This town doesn't need a general anymore. It needs builders. It needs healers. It needs to forget the woman who taught them how to kill. The scars of victory, she realized, were not meant to be a monument. They were a reminder of the price of peace. And she, more than anyone, knew just how high that price could be. The decision, once made, settled in Nora's heart with the quiet finality of a closing door. She had lived in the crucible of violence and strategy for so long that the prospect of peace felt both terrifying and foreign. But she knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that she could not stay. To remain in Heaven's Fall would be to live as a ghost, a constant reminder of the town's darkest night. The people looked at her with reverence, but it was the reverence one gives a monument, not a neighbor. She had become a symbol, and symbols have no place at the dinner table. She made her preparations in secret. She sold her house and her husband's clinic to the town council for a nominal fee, with the stipulation that they be used to house a new doctor and his family. She packed her few remaining possessions into a single, worn leather satchel, a change of clothes, her husband's medical journal, and the worn book on Napoleonic tactics. It felt like a lifetime packed into a small, portable box. She wrote 2 letters. One was to Arthur Blackwood, thanking him for his strength and loyalty, and formally handing command of the Heaven's Fall militia over to him. You are the town's shield now, Arthur, she wrote. Be strong, but be merciful. Remember that the goal of a shield is to protect, not to attack. The second letter was to the town itself, which she left with the Reverend Michael. It was short and simple. It spoke of her love for her husband and for the home they had tried to build. It spoke of her pride in their courage and her unshakable belief in their future. It did not speak of the blood or the fire. It ended with a single line: Haven is not a place you find, it is a thing you build and defend, every single day. Keep building. She chose to leave as she had lived for the past months, in the dark. On a moonless night, a week after her conversation with the sheriff, she slipped out of her room and walked to the livery stable. Billy was on watch, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would raise the alarm. But the boy had become a man. He saw the satchel in her hand, the finality in her eyes, and he understood. He said nothing, but simply opened the stable door for her and prepared a horse, his movements filled with a sad, silent respect. "Where will you go, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice a whisper in the dark. "I'm not sure, Billy," she replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm going to try and find the woman I was before all this. I don't know if she's still out there." She rode out of town, taking the little-used northern trail, melting into the vast, dark desert that had once been her enemy and was now her refuge. She did not look back. When the town awoke to find her gone, a strange and profound sadness settled over them. They had lost their leader, their unlikely savior. The Reverend Michael read her letter from the pulpit of the rebuilt church, his voice thick with emotion. They understood then that her leaving was not an abandonment, but a final act of leadership. She was giving the town back to them, forcing them to stand on their own, to move beyond the shadow of the battle and into the light of their own future. Nora's choice was to disappear. She rode for weeks, seeking not a destination, but anonymity. She traded her black widow's dress for the simple, sturdy clothes of a homesteader. She took a new name, letting Eleanor Vance become what the world had already made her: a memory, a story. She finally settled in a small, quiet valley hundreds of miles away, a green and gentle place that was the antithesis of the harsh desert she had left behind. She bought a small plot of land and began to build a new life, a quiet one. She planted a garden. She read her books. She tried to heal the wounds that no one could see. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, the ghosts would come. She would see the faces of the men she had killed, hear the screams from the burning saloon. The guilt and the grief were scars that would never truly fade. But she would also remember the faces of her militia, of Billy and Arthur and the Reverend, and the look in their eyes when they chose to stand and fight. She had led them into darkness, but she had also led them to the dawn. And that, she prayed, was a legacy her gentle husband would have understood. The legend of Nora Vance had made its choice. It had chosen not the glory of command, nor the tragic martyrdom of a hero's death, but the quiet, difficult, and profoundly human path of trying to live again. The story of Havens Fall and its warrior widow became one of the great and written legends of the territory. Travelers who passed through the town in the years that followed found a place transformed. It was quiet, orderly, and fiercely independent. The men and women there had a look in their eyes of calm, watchful self-reliance. The Havens Fall militia remained the best trained and most disciplined civilian force in the region, a silent deterrent to the chaos that still plagued so much of the frontier. The town had not just survived, it had prevailed. The story of their leader was told in hushed, reverent tones. They called her the Widow of the Dawn, the woman who had led them through the night. They spoke of her brilliant tactics, her iron will, her impossible courage. Every child in town knew the story of how she had turned their simple street into an unbreakable fortress. The legend grew with each telling, smoothing over the rough edges of the fear and the bloodshed, turning a grim, desperate battle into an epic tale of heroism. The story became the town's founding myth, the fire that had forged their new identity. As for the three possible endings to the widow's tale, the people of Havens Fall chose to believe in the one that gave them the most hope. They rejected the idea of a tragic, wounded hero. They did not speak of her as a lonely legend. They believed that their leader, having saved them, had earned her own peace. They told themselves that she had found a quiet valley, a place where the sun was gentle and the memories were kind. They believed that, after a long and terrible night, the widow had finally found a dawn that was entirely her own. And so the story is told. To this day, they say that a quiet strength protects that town, a legacy of the woman who refused to be a victim. Outlaws and troublemakers give Havens Fall a wide berth, not because of its militia, but because of the ghost that is said to watch over it. They say that if you ride towards the town after dark with ill intent in your heart, you can sometimes hear the faint, lonely toll of a single church bell on the window warning. It is the sound of the widow's promise, an oath that echoes through the years, that in this town, the darkness will never win, and the wicked will never live to see the dawn.